Well, let me first briefly introduce myself. As said, my name is Mariken Lenaerts in Dutch, and I'm assistant professor at Maastricht University Law School. I do have a background in legal history and legal philosophy, but I don't have any formal training in didactics. However, I do have some teaching experience by now, particularly in teaching legal history. So what I am about to tell you in the next 15 minutes, hopefully I'll stick to 15 minutes, is based on what I've learned over the years. And I do realize now that my presentation will be slightly different than what you have encountered so far, but I hope I will still be able to keep your attention. Okay, let's start. Okay, we have a tweet here. It has gone viral at a certain moment in time. And even though this particular tweet might not be familiar to you all, I think the general gist is familiar. Anachronisms in movies. So IMDb even has a separate section called Goofs that deals with things like this. But obviously there are different kinds of goofs. We all know about the Starbucks cup that somehow ended up in Game of Thrones. That was obviously not what the Game of Thrones crew intended. So although some people might call this anachronistic, I would not call that so. I would call it simply for what it is, namely a mistake. Since the makers of Game of Thrones did not intend this to happen. However, the mistake that is mentioned in this particular tweet is different. The Waterford crystal that showed up was intended to be in Little Women. So far so good. However, given the period pictured in Little Women, it did not fit. That type of Waterford crystal apparently did not yet exist in the 1870s. So this is an anachronism. And anachronisms are goofs, and goofs are problematic. So how are we going to overcome this problem? That is what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So first of all, I will explain a bit about unintentional anachronisms and what is so problematic about them. Then we will have a look at intentional anachronisms and the way we can benefit from those. Then I'll briefly talk about context, and I'll try to answer the question why all this is even relevant for legal historians and educators in legal history in particular. And then obviously at the end, we'll have a small wrap up to finish. Okay, unintentional anachronism. So as just shown, that goof about the Waterford crystal in Little Women is an anachronism. And this is what I call an unintentional anachronism. The makers thought they were using glassware correct for the period pictured, but unfortunately they were off. However, they thought they were right. And as someone who is not as well versed in the specifics of Waterford crystal as Laura's father and the author of the tweet might from now on think that the type of Waterford crystal used in Little Women was available in the 1870s. And that is problematic because it is wrong. And this is something that legal historians, or I would say historians in general, struggle with as well, both in research and in education. And the basic problem is that we, human beings, are myopic. So how can we not be? Everyone has biases. We have them consciously, but especially unconsciously. We cannot know everything, if even only that was possible. We are by necessity a product of the place and the time that we live in. And this will automatically lead to some sort of tunnel vision. However, if we're not aware of this, and if we don't take active action to avoid these shortcomings, then we will ultimately end up not with knowledge. I'm sorry, I'm a bit off. Okay. We will end up not with knowledge and not with understanding, but merely with assumed knowledge and understanding. So let me give you an example. This is an example on property rights in medieval times, and I will start with a small disclaimer. Since I'm no expert on medieval property rights or property rights in general, I don't want to make a claim on who is correct in the discussion that I am about to present. Okay, In medieval times, basically two types of legal positions with regards to immovables, or land in particular, existed. What we call the allot or allodium. This was a right that was bigger than the current continental right of ownership, continental as in the right of ownership in the civil law tradition, because it also included authority over those who lived on the land, so governmental authority. And there was no distinction made between private and public law as we use that distinction nowadays. Other than that, we also had something that was called fiefs or land tenure. That was a property right of the vassal who held the land in fee in return for some form of feudal allegiance and like service or payment. But then the question pops up, who was the owner as we currently understand ownership in the civil law tradition? And there was a common theory at the time, at a certain moment, that at a certain moment a shift of ownership occurred. Originally, the overlord, the one with the allot, had ownership, which through the centuries gradually shifted to the vassal. That is currently still, that is a theory that is still used. It's a common theory, but it's not undisputed. There is a Dutch legal historian, it's called Martin W.J. de Bruin, who wrote several articles explaining that the use of the concept of ownership to explain medieval concepts was anachronistic, and that aforementioned medieval concepts cannot be compared to contemporary concepts. And by doing so, he explained, an incorrect theory was launched, which did not lead to knowledge, but only to assumed knowledge. So there was no real understanding, but only assumed understanding. Again, without pointing out who is correct, because I don't know, this shows the pitfall of anachronisms. And so regardless who is right, it clouds the discussion and ultimately the understanding that we're looking for. However, does that mean that anachronisms are always a bad thing? One might think so after what I've just explained, but here comes the heartfelt no. No, I do believe that anachronisms can be useful, they can be wonderful, and they can lead to true knowledge and understanding. And again, let me give you an example taken from cinema again. This is the promotion pose for Marie Antoinette, a movie by Sofia Coppola from 2006. It's a movie that received both negative feedback and praise. Critics thought that the movie was historically inaccurate and too light, whilst fans argued that Coppola had succeeded in picturing Marie Antoinette's world through allegedly her own eyes. And those were the eyes of a naive teenager who had never known a different world than the world she lived in, the very rich one, but who also had to shoulder a very heavy duty for a teenager, namely the duty to produce an heir to the throne. And one way Coppola tried to install this picture in the minds of the audience was through the use of deliberate anachronisms. Pop music mixed with period music, lavish candy colors, and modern props. And we see an example here. The Converse sneakers that you see in the background were meant to illustrate Marie Antoinette's naivete, her teenage outlook, and her relative innocence, despite a lifestyle that was highly inappropriate given the problems France faced at the time. This is what I call an intentional anachronism, and if well used, I believe they can be very illuminating. So let's remember that discussion about medieval property rights. And the discussion in itself, regardless of who is right, is already beneficial because it highlights potential anachronisms and it makes people think about the concepts of property rights. And that is something that can be done on purpose. An anachronism can, for example, be introduced in a task that students have to do with the explicit order to find and solve the anachronism and to analyze why the anachronism is an anachronism. And this way, awareness of anachronisms can create true understanding, which allows us to move up from Bloom's level 2 in the Bloom's taxonomy, so from the level of understanding to Bloom's level 4, analyzing. However, to make this work, one essential ingredient is needed, and that is what I'm going to talk about next. The importance of context. Do you have any idea what place on Earth this map represents? Do you know what can be found in the streets that are pictured? Do you know the name of the river that is seen? Do you know what language to speak in those streets pictured? And since I think the majority of you is based in England, I don't mind if you don't know. So that is why I'm going to tell you. This is the very same city pictured. So we've added some context. It's the same layout of streets with context. This is Maastricht in the south of the Netherlands, where I'm currently situated. Now you know that the river is the River Maas. You know where the museum and the fort might be found because that is pictured on the screen. And you also potentially have a better idea of what language will help you whilst roaming the streets of Maastricht. So context, in other words, is extremely important. And again, let's have a look at an historical example. This was taken from the German Reichsgesetzblatt, and it reads, if I translate this in English, all Germans are equal before the law. This is an article that was taken from the German Constitution that was enforced during the Nazi era from 1933 to 1945. It stems from the 1919 Constitution, and it was not repealed when the Nazis came to power. And I don't have to give you an elaborate explanation because you know the context, at least I am assuming that, but I think I'm correct in assuming that. Germans were all but equal during the 12 years of the Nazi era. Still, if you would look only at this particular article, you'd unavoidably get the wrong idea, namely that all Germans were equal. Why? Because of the absence of context. So context, again, is key. And key for recognizing anachronisms and key for the ability to use anachronisms.
Mariken,
okay.
Can I just say you've got another minute or so to wrap up?
Yeah, I think I'm going to manage. Thank you. Okay, so why is this all relevant? Well, obviously it can help us when designing courses, and I hope I showed why anachronisms can be beneficial rather than bad. But from my own experience, I can also tell that students and colleagues sometimes doubt the value of legal history in the curriculum as such. And to those, I would like to say that legal history can serve as a mirror. And through careful use of anachronisms, you can see the present reflected in the past and the past in the present. And so why do we look in the mirror in the morning? And we want to know how we look, and we want to know whether our hair looks good, whether the earrings I chose actually fit my jacket. In short, because I want to gain some knowledge and dispel any assumptions. So it gives me the possibility to correct mistakes, even if it only concerns badly chosen earrings. So if you know the context, I can look terrific in an evening dress, basically, but that would be highly inappropriate if teaching. So let's have a look at my final example then. If we again have a look at medieval times, animal trials in medieval times were quite common. In Saint-Julie in France in 1587, for example, one discussed to excommunicate beetles that had destroyed crops in an orchard, and somewhere else a pig was put to trial because it had killed a child. To our ears, that sounds absolutely weird. Because how can animals be held responsible for what is essentially their natural behavior? And apart from that, what good would a trial do if the ones put to trial are not able to understand what this is all about? However, from a medieval perspective, this made perfect sense. Why? Because at the time, the world was considered to be organized according to a fixed order designed by God. Everyone and everything took up a fixed position according to its nature, and the position of animals was lower than that of humans. Pigs, for example, were not supposed to kill human children, so by punishing the animal, the rightful hierarchy was restored. And looking at it from this perspective, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. And then the mirror part. So if we look at the position of animals nowadays, and some people are very vocal about animal rights, especially when it concerns animals that can be considered sentient, such as apes or elephants. But also dogs and cats generally enjoy a very protective status as well. So some animals we cuddle, but others we eat, such as pigs, who on average are not less intelligent than a dog. Well, this is not the time and place to start vouching for animal rights, however, but the only thing I want to show is to let the mirror do its work. Were they weird, or are we myopic, and perhaps also a tad hypocritical? So my final slide. So to wrap up, how can we overcome the pitfalls of anachronisms, which are real? We can use them intentionally, but in context, and identify the differences between then and now. Use our gained knowledge to reevaluate our current assumptions and knowledge and adjust. And if we do that, I'm convinced legal history can have a place in any law curriculum. Thank you, and my apologies for taking up so long.